By the end of the 1920s, the Castellamarese War broke out between two powerful bosses, Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. In 1931, upcoming mob leader Lucky Luciano would devise a plan to take out both bosses and restructure the way the Mafia operated, as too much bloodshed and public attention was raining down on them. The first step was taking out Joe the Boss, and Lucky called on one of his most trusted hitmen to help him, Anastasia. Joe the Boss, his bodyguards, and Lucky Luciano all met at a seafood restaurant at 3 p.m. on April 15, 1931. The restaurant was one that Masseria visited on numerous occasions, called the Nuovo Villa Tamaro on Coney Island. Luciano excused himself from a card game they were playing to pay a visit to the bathroom. This was the signal for the hitmen to come in. Anastasia was seen with Bugsy Siegel pulling up outside the restaurant next to Joe the Boss's armored plated car. Also on the hit was Vito Genovese and Joe Adonis. Over 20 shots were fired from .32 and .38 caliber pistols, 4 of which went straight into the back of Masseria and 1 into his head. Months later, another hit team went after Maranzano, putting an end to the war and allowing Lucky and his aides to restructure the mob and create a governing body known as the Commission. The only thing missing was an enforcement wing to carry out the orders. Not long after, a new mafia gang would appear on the streets of New York that would strike fear and terror into the underworld. That gang was Murder Incorporated. At the top of the chain was Anastasia, a formidable hitman who controlled the New York waterfront and the dockworker unions. The press would eventually go on to label him with the intimidating nickname, the Lord High Executioner. Tropea, a small fishing village on the east coast of Calabria, tucked away down in southern Italy. On September 29, 1902, the peaceful and picturesque seaside town would see the birth of a future mob leader unlike no other. A man with a volatile temper, a man who used violence to work his way up the mob ladder, a man who would go by the birth name of Umberto Anastasio, who would go on to lead Murder Incorporated and stamp his mark as one of history's most feared mafia leaders. Albert was one of 12 children, 8 brothers and 3 sisters. His father, Raffaello, who was a railroad worker, died when Albert was 10 years old. He would soon quit school to work as a deckhand on tramp steamers at the local shipping yard to help support his family. This was a dangerous job, and he had to be both mentally and physically strong, something which Albert was. At the age of 15, he left Italy as a stowaway on a ship bound for New York with his brother Anastasio. Anthony, later to be known as Tough Tony, was the only other member of the family to make inroads into organized crime. Albert touched down in New York in 1917 with no money, tattered clothes, and hardly any education. What he did have was strength and determination, which helped him land a job moving ship cargo as a longshoreman on the Brooklyn docks. This was a place where he would grow in stature and power, and a place that in 1942 where he would find himself helping with the war effort. Those who worked the docks had to kick back part of their wages to the mob. But one of the perks of working down the docks was that the Mafia, who controlled it, looked the other way when it came to workers stealing some of the cargo. There would often be confrontations when workers fought over cargo, but nothing compared to what we would see in 1920. Another worker by the name of Joe Torino got into an argument with 18-year-old Albert over cargo. The verbal agreement turned physical, and punches were thrown before the mob boss brandished a knife and stabbed Torino to death. Witnesses to the incident commented on the look on Albert's face and how his eyes looked cold and dark, a characteristic that would appear years later. He was quickly convicted of murder and sent up the river to Sing Sing prison to await execution in the electric chair. But he would never make it to the chair. After 18 months, his conviction was overturned. Jimmy the Shiv DeStefano was serving time in Sing Sing during the early 1920s. As well as working as the prison barber, he was also an aide to the upcoming Lucky Luciano. DeStefano would report back to the soon-to-be chairman of the mob that Albert would be a perfect addition to his young group of mobsters, and he was a guy he could really use. Lucky essentially saved Albert's life. Before a new retrial could begin, Lucky's hitmen got rid of the witnesses and Albert walked free from prison on a technicality and into a new life as part of the Mafia, learning one important key point: if you have witnesses, get rid of them. After stepping out of Sing Sing as a free man, Albert would soon realize that the world around him had changed. Prohibition had kicked into force by 1920 and would be exploited by the mob for years to come. The 20-year-old Albert Anastasio had also decided to change his name to Anastasia. He was now connected to the mob, surrounded by the likes of Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Lepke Buchalter. Anastasia went back to the waterfront, but this time he was controlling local gambling and taking care of the mob's loan sharking rackets. In the 1920s, his position and power in the Longshoremen's Union grew. During 1920 to 1923, Anastasia was associated with some 30 assassinations, but wasn't indicted or convicted on any of them. In April 1923, Anastasia and Biagio Giordana, an early Black Hand member, were fired upon from a ground floor window as they drove down Sackett Street in Brooklyn. Giordana was killed, but Anastasia had a lucky escape, albeit he was badly wounded in the attack. In the same year, Anastasia was caught on a gun possession charge, which would see him go back behind bars until 1925. By the end of the 1920s, the Castellamarese War broke out between two powerful bosses by the name of Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both men were born in the town of Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily, and both were from the Mustache Pete era of the mob who ran the Mafia in the old world ways. Over the next 2 years, we would see one of the bloodiest eras in mob history, as both men fought for power and control on the streets of New York. Lucky Luciano was the man who managed to put an end to the war in 1931 and restructure how the Mafia worked. The first step was taking out Joe the Boss with the help of mob hitman Albert Anastasia. Joe the Boss was dining with Lucky Luciano at his favorite seafood restaurant on Coney Island. At 3 p.m. on April 15, 1931, Luciano excused himself from the table to go to the bathroom. At the same time, the hit team rushed the building and fired off shots at the unsuspecting Masseria. Over 20 shots were fired, 4 of which went straight into the back of Masseria and 1 in his head, killing him. Later that year, it was Maranzano's turn, but Anastasia was to sit this one out. Maranzano was taken out in his Manhattan office, which paved the way for Lucky to take control of New York. Soon after, Luciano created a group called the Commission, which consisted of 5 mob bosses who all shared equal power in the hope that this new group would help to avoid any gang wars in the future by settling disputes in a voting-style system.
The Mafia Commission was created in the wake of the destruction of the old way of doing things, where it was basically monarchy. Luciano and his associates despised that concept. The board of directors was comprised of all the top brass in the mob. Jewish and Italian gangsters were on the board of directors.
In 1929, Lucky Luciano, with the help of his close associates, put together a governing body called the Mafia Commission. The commission was made up of New York's top mob bosses with the aim of helping to settle conflicts between families and to sanction murders. But they needed an enforcement arm to carry out the hits. a new mafia gang would soon appear on the streets of New York that would strike fear and terror into the underworld. That gang was Murder Incorporated, and it operated from a candy store in Brooklyn. At the top of the chain were Lepke Buckhalter, a labor racketeer and contracted killer, and Albert Anastasia, an intimidating hitman who controlled the New York waterfront and the dockworker unions. Murder, Inc. was responsible for over 1,000 estimated mob hits during their active years, and Anastasia would take great pleasure from being a central part of the hits that were handed down from the commission. Murder, Inc. was made up of some of the most ruthless, organized, efficient, and effective hitmen under Anastasia's leadership. Mindy Wise. Born July 1906 in New York, Wise was one of Lepke Buckhalter's most trusted men and was on the scene in the 1935 Dutch Schultz hit. Died March 1944 at the age of 37 in Old Sparky, Sing Sing Prison's electric chair. Harry Happy Mayoni. Born October 1908 in New York, Mayoni was called Happy because he constantly wore a frown on his face. In 1931, Mayoni and Abundando helped Abe Relis and Martin Goldstein eliminate the three Shapiro brothers. Died February 1942 at the age of 33 in Old Sparky. Martin Bugsy Goldstein. Born October 1905 in New York, Goldstein was a prominent member of Murder, Inc. and actually had the tip of his nose blown off during a shootout with the Shapiro brothers. Died June 1941 at the age of 36 in Old Sparky. Charles the Bug Workman. Born October 1908 in New York, responsible for the Dutch Schultz murder in 1935 and one of the few hitmen that didn't end up sitting in Old Sparky or slain. He did, however, end up with life imprisonment, but was released in 1964. Died 1979 at the age of 70 of natural causes. Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss. Born 1909 in New York, Strauss was one of the most prolific killers in the gang, using a variety of methods that included shooting, stabbing with ice picks, drowning, live burial, and strangulation. Died 1941 at the age of 31 in Old Sparky. Frank the Dasher Abundando. Born 1910 in New York, Abundando loved to stab his victims through the heart with an ice pick as his favorite method of killing. It was reported he displayed no fear and seemed to find a morbid humor in the proceedings surrounding his fate. Died February 1942 at the age of 31 in Old Sparky. Abe Kid Twist Relis. Born 1906 in New York, perhaps one of the most famous members who turned informant was Relis. He was responsible for the executions of many key Murder, Inc. members, including one of the bosses, Lepke. He was ultimately the reason for the downfall of Murder, Inc. However, he wouldn't live for long himself. Died November 1941 at the age of 35 from falling out of a window before he could give evidence that would have led to the conviction and possible execution of Albert Anastasia. Lepke Buckhalter. Born February 1897 in New York, Lepke was the oldest member of the squad and was one of the premier labor racketeers in New York City during that era. He was also a close friend of Anastasia's and is the only American mob boss to have received the death penalty. Died March 1944 at the age of 47 in Old Sparky. One thing that Anastasia made sure of during his time with Murder, Inc. was the valuable lesson he learned in prison: get rid of your witnesses. 1932, Anastasia was indicted on charges of murdering another man with an ice pick, but the case was dropped due to the lack of witnesses. 1933, Joe Santoro, a laundryman working in New York, didn't like paying kickbacks to the mob, so the mob taught him a lesson. Santoro was gunned down by Anastasia in front of witnesses, but suddenly the witnesses suffered from amnesia or went missing. 1939, Pete Panto, a longshoreman who organized a rank-and-file revolt to rid the union of racketeering, was silenced by Anastasia. He was strangled and buried in a lime pit. It was 1935. That would be a year when Murder, Inc. would be tested, and that would come from the assassination of Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx. It was, in fact, Anastasia that got the ball rolling in the plot to try and assassinate Thomas Dewey, who was an emerging threat to the Mafia and their operations. Anastasia staked out Dewey's Fifth Avenue apartment and noted his morning routine. He even borrowed a baby carriage to walk past his apartment, acting as a doting father, just to get closer to Dewey. As soon as the commission got wind of what he was up to, they pulled him in and told him not to take out Dewey because of the intense heat it would bring down on the mob's hierarchy. Anastasia took the hint, but the Dutchman didn't. Dutch Schultz, who was under investigation by Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, was on the verge of being convicted for tax evasion. In an effort to avert his conviction, Schultz asked the commission for permission to take out Dewey. The commission denied his request, as it would bring down too much heat on the mob. But Schultz, who had a fiery temper, decided he would find a way to take Dewey out of the game and approached Albert Anastasia for help. Anastasia, aware of the repercussions, took his information to Luciano, and the commission held an emergency meeting. The result of that meeting equaled a contract on the Dutchman. Dutch Schultz was shot once, below the heart, in the bathroom of the Palace Chop House restaurant, but managed to stagger out and sit at a table. The hit was carried out by Murder, Inc. members Charles Workman and Mendy Wise, acting on orders handed down from Lepke Buckhalter. Despite Anastasia and Luciano attempting to avert law enforcement interest by taking Schultz out of the equation, it backfired. Dewey needed someone else to focus on, and that man was now Lucky Luciano. On June 7, 1936, Luciano was convicted on 62 counts of forced prostitution and was handed a 30 to 50-year sentence. This would rock the underworld. The chairman of the mob had been scooped up, and if they could get him, they could get anyone. During 1937, things were quiet, and Anastasia took this opportunity to marry the 19-year-old Elsa Barnesi. Elsa, 18 years Anastasia's junior, had moved from Canada to New York, and together they had 2 sons and 2 daughters. When asked about her husband and his connection to the New York underworld, she refused that he was anything but a hard-working, honest, and law-abiding citizen. Anastasia would claim that he owned a dress factory and was a mattress salesman. Elsa claimed that he was a regular churchgoer, that he never drank, and that he was home by 9 p.m. every night. Their marriage would last right up until Anastasia's assassination in 1957. It is then alleged that Elsa changed her name back to Barnesi and moved back to Canada sometime in the late 1950s. Married life certainly didn't get between him and the mob, though, and Anastasia was once again called upon. Murder, Inc. frontman Lepke Buckhalter was on the verge of being convicted on racketeering and narcotics charges and asked for Anastasia's help in hiding him and disposing witnesses. Anastasia did just that. Over a dozen witnesses disappeared, and Lepke went into hiding. Over the next few years, a national and international manhunt was organized to find Buckhalter, with the government offering a $5,000 reward for information leading to his capture. Sightings were reported from Poland and the UK, but Anastasia had hidden him right under everyone's noses in Brooklyn. May 25, 1939. Murder, Inc. hitman and close associate of the Lord High Executioner, Jack the Dandy Parisi, was given the job to kill Teamster official and Buckhalter witness Morris Diamond. Diamond was a key witness in one of Buckhalter's cases and needed to be removed. 6:15 p.m. Diamond is spotted walking down the street on his daily commute. Parisi approached him from the other side of the street, his gun concealed by a newspaper. As Parisi got closer, he lowered his paper and blasted Diamond. Anastasia watched the events unfold from further down the street. The murder wasn't enough, though, and the heat from law officials on the mob was getting hotter by the minute. The commission pushed Anastasia to give up Buckhalter. It was time for Anastasia to pick between his friend and the mob. He chose the mob. Anastasia would speak with the now unrecognizable Buckhalter, who had been in hiding for over 3 years, sporting a mustache and having put on an extra few pounds of weight. Anastasia told him the lawyers had managed to cut him a deal with the FBI and he would only have to serve a few years behind bars. On August 24, 1939, Buckhalter turned himself in. Radio broadcaster Walter Winchell negotiated the deal and sent out a broadcast across the airwaves to Lepke to hand himself over. Lepke phoned Winchell, and the radio broadcaster told Lepke to be at 28th Street and 5th Avenue at just after 10 p.m. that evening, and to be alone. Unknown to Winchell, more than 24 agents had the corner under surveillance. Having picked up Lepke several blocks away, Winchell pulled up beside Hoover's car, which was parked in front of a Manhattan hotel. Winchell and Lepke left their vehicle and jumped in the back of Hoover's limousine. This was the end of the road for Buckhalter. He was later charged with the 1936 killing of Joseph Rosen, a Brooklyn candy store owner who refused to leave town when told to by Buckhalter. The conversation to kill Rosen was overheard by mob turncoat Abe Relis. By 1944, Lepke was sitting in Old Sparky and would make history as the first mob boss to ever been put to death by execution. The downfall of Murder, Inc. came in 1940 when one of Anastasia's best hitmen turned government informant, giving up everything on Murder, Inc., including unsolved murders, all in an effort to save himself from going to the electric chair after being implicated in several murders. Key Murder, Inc. members all ended up in the electric chair based on Relis's testimony, including Lepke Buckhalter. Next on the cards was the Lord High Executioner, and Relis had plenty of dirt on the Murder, Inc. boss, including the 1939 murder of Morris Diamond and the 1939 murder of Union longshoreman Pete Panto. However, unlike Lepke, Anastasia had connections and power within the mob, and it would be this key element that would help him in 1941.
Frank's nickname was the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and that will tell you a little bit about what kind of a mobster he was. He wasn't known to be prone to violence. He liked to solve problems diplomatically when he could. But he was living in a world where that wasn't always possible. And when you're swimming in such deep waters, you got to make friends with some sharks, and that's what he did. And he made alliances with guys like Albert Anastasia, who provided him with muscle, and in turn, he provided them with political support and political cover.
November 1941. Abe Relis was staying at the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island. His room was under 24-hour FBI protection. Guards were everywhere, and no one could get close to the former Murder, Inc. hitman. The FBI were under strict instructions to keep him safe until he could testify against Anastasia, the last mobster he would testify against and send to the chair. November 12, 1941, Abe Relis was found dead on the roof of the hotel's restaurant in what was believed to have been a suicide attempt from his window up on the 5th floor. Others believe he was pushed from the window, and the knotted bed sheets that hung from his room were simply a diversion to make it look like suicide. In a grand jury testimony, all 5 policemen who were placed in charge of keeping Relis safe all claimed to have fallen asleep as events unfolded. They knew nothing, heard nothing, saw nothing. With no evidence of who killed him, charges on Anastasia were dropped. What we do know is that an attempt to kill Relis could not have been sanctioned without Anastasia's approval. District Attorney William O'Dwyer said the perfect case on Anastasia had collapsed. During 1942, Anastasia had signed up to the Army as a tech sergeant. a job that would help him with his application to become a naturalized citizen, which he was granted a year later in 1943 before being discharged from the army due to his age in 1944. By 1945, Anastasia had moved to a fortress of a mansion located on the Palisades Cliffs at 75 Bluff Road, Fort Lee, New Jersey, with sweeping views of Manhattan and just around the corner from Joe Adonis. The 1.3-acre estate had 34 rooms, 5 bathrooms, and had barbed wire across the perimeter of the compound, complete with 2 large Dobermans. His new mansion was one giant leap up from Pioneer Street in Red Hook's Little Italy, where he lived during the 1920s and 1930s after stepping out of Sing Sing. The mansion, some 20 miles north of his Pioneer Street roots, would soon become a focal point in an upcoming tax evasion scandal in the 1950s and would see more bodies lining the streets of America. Anastasia claimed to have earned $145 and listed his occupation as a dress contractor for the Madison Dress Company. He also listed a few other occupations over the years, including a 4-year stretch between 1936 to 1940 where he was in the cheese business. However, none of these jobs could have given him the financial backing to purchase a $100,000 property. With the eyes of the law on him and the FBI questioning everyone around him, Anastasia called on his first ever lesson: get rid of potential witnesses. In April 1954, his bodyguard Vincent Macri was killed. Macri knew too much about Anastasia's financial affairs and could have been a witness in his tax evasion trial. A year later, in May 1955, plumber Charles Ferry and his wife were killed. Ferry was on the verge of testifying on the services he had provided Anastasia in his Fort Lee mansion, a total cost of services which were around $9,000. Ferry was never found. His house and yard were covered in blood, and a pair of blood-soaked shoes were the only things found. With many witnesses dead or having disappeared, Anastasia's charges were reduced, and he was given a 1-year prison sentence. With Murder, Inc. no longer operating, Anastasia would go back to being just an underboss to Vincent Mangano. However, after being the leader of his own gang for years, Anastasia wasn't about to settle as an underboss to a boss he didn't respect or see eye to eye with. A power move was about to take place in the Mafia that would enrage the Commission and cause friction between families. And once again, Anastasia was at the center of it. Vincent Mangano, who sat at the top of what is now known as the Gambino crime family since 1931, back when Lucky Luciano had restructured the mob and created a governing body to settle disputes and feuds between families. After 20 years, enough was enough for Anastasia. The heated tension between the two mobsters, stirred in with a resentment that Mangano had with Anastasia's close ties to Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, finally hit boiling point in April 1951. Mob boss Vincent Mangano and his brother Philip Mangano were declared missing in 1951. Philip's body was found and recovered in April of that year from a Brooklyn swamp. He had been shot once in each cheek and once in the neck. As for Vincent, his body was never found. Anastasia, if found guilty, had just broken an important mafia rule that was punishable by death: the killing of a mob boss. After Vincent's disappearance and a confirmed death of Philip, Anastasia declared himself boss of the family. However, he wasn't in the clear just yet, as the commission had called him to a meeting. Anastasia went into the meeting claiming that the Mangano brothers wanted to kill him, and he acted in self-defense. With the backing of his ally Frank Costello and other members of the ruling panel, the commission officially confirmed Albert Anastasia as the new family boss. Just months after taking the helm at the top of the crime family tree, Anastasia found himself in hot water and having to answer to the commission once again, this time with fellow mobster Willie Moretti, who was underboss to his cousin and current boss of the Luciano family, Frank Costello. Anastasia and Moretti were acting as emissaries for the purpose of paying off a convicted bookmaker to keep him silent. Moretti was given the job of handling the payment, which was said to have been $200,000. The only problem, that wasn't the amount Moretti handed over, and the commission wanted to know why. Anastasia claimed that he had nothing to do with the payoff, so his life was spared. Moretti, he wasn't as lucky. On October 4th, 1951, Moretti attended a lunchtime sitting with 4 other mobsters at Joe's Elbow Room restaurant in New Jersey. At 11:28 a.m., the restaurant staff heard shots fired and ran into the dining room. Moretti was lying dead on his back on the floor with bullet wounds to the face and head. The hit was said to have been a mercy killing, orders passed down by Vito Genovese, which it was in many ways. But the Moretti killing was much more than that as well. He had double-crossed the mob, something that didn't go too well for Bugsy Siegel a few years earlier in 1947. It wasn't long until Anastasia was once again in the limelight, and once again for all the wrong reasons. This time he had broken another mafia rule, the killing of a citizen.
Were you afraid at any time while you were following him? No, at that time fear didn't enter my mind, but when I got home and I thought about what I did, then I started getting a little nervous.
In 1952, Albert Anastasia was living in a fortified mansion in New Jersey, and for the first time since the Murder Inc. days, he was a mob boss. He was also becoming more uncontrollable, more volatile, and was on the verge of putting another nail into his coffin. February 20th, 1952, Willie Sutton, a mafia-connected bank robber, is captured by police after being spotted on a subway and then followed on foot by 24-year-old clothing salesman and amateur detective Arnold Schuster. The news of the capture made it not only to the front of newspapers, but also onto national TV. Schuster was interviewed on TV near his home discussing the apprehension of the bank robber.
Were you afraid at any time while you were following him? No, at that time fear didn't enter my mind, but when I got home and I thought about what I did, then I started getting a little nervous.
The broadcast was seen by many, including the Lord High Executioner, who was said to have been outraged that Schuster had ratted out Willie Sutton. According to government informant Joe Valachi, during the 1963 McClellan hearings, Anastasia had issued the order to silence the clothing salesman, and it was carried out less than a month after his TV appearance on the 9th of March, 1952. Schuster was shot twice in the groin and once in each eye, the mob punishment for squealing. May 1955. The Lord High Executioner is found guilty of tax evasion for underreporting the income he earned from the late 1940s. Despite his best efforts to get rid of witnesses and dodge the case that was building against him, he was finally sentenced to a year behind bars. While he was serving the first few months of his sentence, the government were also pursuing a petition to revoke Anastasia's citizenship so he could be deported back to Italy. By late 1955, the deportation ruling had been overturned, and Anastasia was free to remain in the U.S. After Anastasia's tax evasion stretch was up in 1956, he came out in the middle of a new power grab. Lucky was gone. Lepke was gone. Murder Inc. was no more. There was just him and Costello. But Costello was about to have a close encounter of his own kind in May 1957 with a power-hungry and violent mobster called Vito Genovese, who was conspiring a power move with Albert Anastasia's underboss, Carlo Gambino. Vito Genovese had patiently waited 10 years to attempt a hit on Costello, and that time came in 1957. Genovese had ordered Vincent Chin Gigante to assassinate Costello as he was walking to the elevator in the lobby of his Manhattan apartment. As Costello got closer to the elevator, Gigante, who was behind him, shouted out, "This is for you, Frank." Frank then turned around quickly, and the bullet somehow inflicted minor damage across his head. Gigante, thinking he had just killed Costello, fled the scene. If Gigante hadn't alerted Costello, he would have been killed. This close shave was enough to make Frank step down as boss and hand the family over to Genovese. And as Lucky was still held up in prison, he was powerless to stop Genovese. This now left Albert Anastasia open to attack, as he had lost all of his allies.
Well, when it comes to the hit on Frank Costello, depending on what you read and what time frame that was written, you get vastly different reports on the subject there. If you read stuff from the early days, like some of the early newspaper articles that were written around the time that the hit on Frank Costello happened, which was 1957, and some of the earlier books on like this one, they claimed that they were actually enemies and that it was Albert Anastasia that orchestrated the hit on Frank. People accept that Vito Genovese had orchestrated the hit on Frank Costello. A lot of times what you'll hear too is that Vito got rid of Albert Anastasia to kind of weaken Frank Costello and then went after Frank. But when you look at those hits, it's actually backwards. Frank Costello was hit first, and it was Albert Anastasia that was hit a few months afterwards.
With Genovese turning mobsters against Anastasia and gaining followers of his own, the Lord High Executioner's place at the top was becoming much more unstable. So much so that he started to encroach on Meyer Lansky's territory and take control over some of the Havana casino operations. Meyer had always been part of that core group of allies, but this new bid to muscle in on his turf had angered Lansky. Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino were now primed to take out the former Murder Inc. mob boss and instill Gambino as the new leader of the Anastasia family. 26th October, 1957. The evening before Anastasia was gunned down. Santo Trafficante, a mob boss and powerhouse who operated in Florida, had come into town to discuss business with Anastasia. The two mobsters were looking to make inroads into a new hotel in Cuba, an area where Trafficante already had interests. Information later obtained speculated that Trafficante was trying to convince Anastasia to invest in a casino within the Hilton Hotel in Havana. It was also alleged that Trafficante had major involvement in the murder plot on Anastasia due to the Mad Hatter's attempt to shoulder in on fellow mob leaders' Cuban interests. The meeting ended in the evening, and Anastasia would return home for the last time. October 27, 1957, 10 a.m. It was around 40 degrees Fahrenheit that morning in Manhattan. Anastasia and his bodyguard Anthony Coppola pulled up outside the Park Sheraton. The Park Sheraton was built in the pre-Depression late 20s, and with its grand opening taking place on June 12, 1927. Just over a year after the opening, it would hit the newspapers as being the site of a high-profile mob shooting. In November 1928, the 46-year-old businessman and mob kingpin Arnold Rothstein was gunned down during a business meeting at the hotel, which resulted due to his failure to pay gambling debts exceeding $300,000, over $4 million in today's money. 29 years later, it was home to another high-profile mob hit. Anastasia stepped out of the car and entered Arthur Grasso's barbershop for his regular haircut, shave, and hot towel. Coppola parked the car in the underground garage, leaving Anastasia on his own with the barber. He was in the process of having a hot towel shave. The barber had just applied the towel to his face as two gunmen walked into the shop. The two men, faces covered with scarves to protect their identity, ushered the barber to one side. With Anastasia in a state of relaxation and the barber safely out of the way, the gunmen unleashed a tirade of bullets at the chair. Anastasia leaped up, pulling the towel off his face. He lunged forward at what he thought were the attackers, but in that moment of complete confusion, disorientation, and panic, what he actually lunged at was the mirror showing their reflections as they stood behind the Lord High Executioner, firing at him. Bullets ripped through his back, hip, and hand, and as the Lord High Executioner dropped, a final bullet was fired into his head. The air fell quiet as the gunmen made their escape, and on the floor, on his back in a pool of blood, swathed in white towels, was Albert Anastasia, dead. His funeral took place just 24 hours later, on 28th October, at Greenwood Cemetery in South Brooklyn. Just 12 people attended the ceremony, including his oldest son, Albert Jr., wife and bodyguard Anthony Coppola, who was arrested after the funeral to undergo questioning. There wasn't any spectacular send-off like you would see with most mob bosses or mobsters with notable power. No key mafia members attended either, which sent a clear message that Anastasia had been outcasted by this time. In February 1958, a few months after the hit on the Lord High Executioner, word got out that the Irish mob were in a war with him over control of the Brooklyn waterfront. With orders coming down from Carlo Gambino to Joe Profaci, 2 hitmen were said to have disposed of Anastasia. Allegedly, the Gallo crew, headed by Crazy Joe Gallo, were given the contract. The hitmen fled to Cleveland not long after the barbershop event, and it is said that the fate of the 2 mobsters were to be discussed at the infamous Appalachian meeting a few months later. To this day, though, no one truly knows who the hitmen were. Months after the death of Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese summoned all the mob's top echelon to a meeting in Appalachian. The purpose of the meeting was to announce his leadership of his own crime family and to also discuss mafia operations. Over 100 high-profile mobsters attended the meeting, which roused suspicion from the local police, who in turn notified the FBI. During the meeting, the house was raided and 58 arrests were made. Rather than helping propel Vito Genovese into the mafia limelight as the new boss of bosses, this was to be the beginning of the end for Don Vito, as many mobsters blamed him for the unwanted press and attention that the mafia had as a result of this police raid. Vito Genovese was eventually set up by Lucky Luciano in the year following the Appalachian disaster and was indicted on charges of conspiring to import and sell narcotics. He was jailed in 1959 for 15 years and eventually died from a heart attack in 1969. As for Carlo Gambino, he went on to make a great success of his position at the top of the crime family, changing its name to what we know it as today, the Gambino crime family. He lived until 1976, age 74. That day in 1957, in the barber shop at the Park Sheraton, brought a close to one of the most violent eras of organized crime. And as one chapter in mob history drew to close, it left the door wide open to a whole new chapter in the Mafia.
Did Lucky Luciano set up Vito Genovese? Well, it wouldn't be surprising if he did, considering that Genovese, one-time friend, had basically turned against another close friend, which was Frank Costello, and tried to have him assassinated. So it really wouldn't be a surprise if Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky and some of the other old crew would have set up or assisted in law enforcement setting up Vito Genovese.
Now, whether or not I think Albert Anastasia and Frank Costello were allies or enemies, I think that they were more likely allies. There's a lot of stories that came out after from Frank Costello's lawyer, this one here, Prime Minister of the Underworld, George Wolfe, who you can see in this cool picture with Frank Costello. He seems to think that they were friends, and he was a lawyer to both of them. I think he would have known probably if they would have been enemies, and he would have written about that. That would have been something good to write about. And Ed Bennett Williams, he says the same thing in his book too, and he was a lawyer to both of them as well. He's got stories in there of the two of them being together and seemingly getting along. So I think, as far as what I believe, I think that they were actually allies.